It started on an ordinary Thursday evening, though something in the air already felt different. My husband came home earlier than usual, his tie loosened, his face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. "I have news," he announced, setting his briefcase down. "My son is moving in with us for a while." I froze for a moment, the smile on my face carefully composed. His son? It had been years since I'd last seen him, still a boy then, awkward and reserved. I wondered what he was like now. My mind ran through the possibilities as my husband explained. Apparently, he was transitioning to a new city for work and needed somewhere to stay while finding his footing. That evening, as I set the table for dinner, I felt a peculiar unease. The kind that whispers from the corners of your mind but doesn't yet have a name. When the doorbell rang, my husband rushed to answer it, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my dress. Then I heard his voice, deeper than I remembered, confident, with a faint touch of charm that caught me off guard. He entered the kitchen, his presence commanding in a way I hadn't anticipated. He wasn't a boy anymore. Broad-shouldered, with a disarming smile and an ease about him that seemed almost practiced. His eyes lingered on me a moment longer than they should have. "Thank you for letting me stay," he said, his voice smooth. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Of course not," I replied, my tone lighter than I felt inside. "Make yourself at home." The evening unfolded like a carefully rehearsed play. My husband, oblivious to the subtle tension building in the room, dominated the conversation with stories from work. I laughed at all the right moments, nodded where appropriate, but my focus kept straying to the man across from me. He was different from my husband in every way. Where my husband was predictable and stable, his son was enigmatic, almost daring. Later, as I cleared the plates, he followed me into the kitchen. The space felt smaller with him in it, the air heavier. "You've done a lot with the place," he remarked, leaning casually against the counter. His eyes scanned the room before landing back on me. "Your father wanted a change," I replied, avoiding his gaze. "And you?" The question hung in the air, its weight pressing down on me. I turned to the sink, rinsing a plate that no longer needed cleaning. "Change can be good," I said finally, my voice quieter. The moment passed, but it left an imprint, a crack in the walls I'd built around myself. As I lay in bed that night, listening to my husband's steady breathing, I couldn't stop replaying the way his son had looked at me. Not just as his father's wife, but as a woman. The next morning started with the same routine. My husband left early for work and I stayed behind to manage the house. I thought the day would be uneventful, but his son, already awake and sitting at the dining table with a cup of coffee, shifted the dynamic in ways I couldn't have foreseen. "Good morning," he said, his voice softer than the night before. He was dressed casually, a simple t-shirt that clung just enough to hint at the shape beneath. I forced myself to look away, my thoughts scattered. "Good morning," I replied, reaching for the coffee pot. My fingers brushed his as he passed me a mug. A small, accidental touch, but enough to send a ripple through the air between us. I turned away quickly, hiding the warmth that had risen to my cheeks. We made small talk about the city, his plans, his work. But beneath the surface, there was a current I couldn't ignore. His words were polite, but his tone carried a layer of something unspoken, as if testing the boundaries of what could be said. "I didn't expect to find myself here," he admitted, sipping his coffee. His gaze lingered on me. "But it's not so bad." I laughed nervously. "Well, I hope you'll feel at home." "I already do," he replied, his eyes meeting mine in a way that made it impossible to look away. I busied myself with tasks around the house, determined to distract my mind. But everywhere I turned, there he was. His presence unavoidable, his footsteps soft yet noticeable. By midday I found myself in the garden, hoping for some peace. He joined me, of course. "This is nice," he said, looking around. "Peaceful." "It is," I agreed, though my heart wasn't calm. His proximity made it hard to focus. He sat on the bench beside me, closer than necessary. "You seem different from what I remember," he said, his voice low. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Time changes people." "Not always," he countered. "Some things stay the same." There was a weight in his words, an invitation I didn't want to acknowledge. I stood abruptly, brushing off my hands. "I should check on lunch." He didn't move. "You're avoiding something," he said, his tone teasing but firm. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, forcing a smile as I turned toward the house. That evening my husband returned, tired and distracted as usual. Over dinner, I found myself hyper-aware of every movement, every glance exchanged across the table. It was unbearable, the way his son's presence disrupted the quiet equilibrium of my life. And yet, a part of me didn't want it to stop. Later, as I prepared for bed, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My reflection felt like a stranger's. My cheeks slightly flushed, my hair falling loose over my shoulders. I chose a nightgown that was more elegant than necessary, unsure why I cared. When I stepped out of the bedroom to grab some water, I found him in the dimly lit kitchen, leaning against the counter. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something like that," he replied. There was a pause before he added, "You seem restless too." I should have turned and left, but I didn't. I stood there, the silence stretching between us, heavy and charged. Then, as if pulled by an invisible force, I stepped closer. "You should get some rest," I said finally, my voice faltering. "So should you," he replied, his eyes locking with mine. Before I could respond, he reached out, his fingers grazing mine in a way that felt deliberate. The moment froze, 1,000 thoughts racing through my mind. I knew I should walk away, but my feet wouldn't move. It happened so quickly I barely registered it. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a fleeting, stolen kiss. It was tentative, testing, but enough to ignite something deep within me. I pulled back, my breath caught in my throat. "This can't happen," I managed to whisper, though my voice betrayed my conviction. He didn't argue, didn't press. He just nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before stepping away. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, the memory of that kiss burned in my mind. It was wrong, I knew that. But it awakened something I hadn't felt in years. A spark I couldn't ignore no matter how much I tried. The next morning was quieter than usual. My husband had left for work early, and I found myself lingering in the kitchen longer than I should have, staring out the window. I told myself I needed to focus, to forget what had happened the night before. But my mind betrayed me. Every detail of that fleeting moment replayed itself. His touch, his breath, the weight of his gaze. I shook my head and busied myself with chores, anything to drown out the thoughts. But it didn't take long before I heard his voice behind me. "Morning," he said casually as if nothing had happened. He leaned against the doorframe, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, observing me. "Morning," I replied, not turning around. My voice sounded more composed than I felt. I expected him to leave, to let the awkwardness dissipate. Instead, he moved closer, his presence like a shadow that clung to me no matter where I went. "About last night," he began, his tone deliberately calm, but I cut him off. "It was a mistake," I said quickly, turning to face him. "It can't happen again." He tilted his head, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You keep saying that, but I'm not sure you believe it." His confidence unnerved me, and I hated that he was right. I didn't know what to say, so I turned back to the sink, my hands gripping the edge. "You make it sound so simple," I said after a long pause, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not." "It could be," he replied, stepping closer. I could feel the warmth of him behind me, his breath brushing against my hair. "If you let it." I turned sharply, my heart pounding. "I can't," I said firmly, though the crack in my voice betrayed me. "I won't." For a moment we stood there in silence, the air between us charged. Then he stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "All right," he said, his tone lighter. "I'll behave." But there was a flicker of something in his eyes. A challenge, a promise. It sent a shiver down my spine. That evening, my husband suggested a family outing to a nearby park. He was trying, I realized. Trying to reconnect, to bring us closer. I told myself I should be grateful. And yet, as we walked along the winding paths, his son's presence was inescapable. We reached a small clearing with a picnic area, and my husband suggested we rest for a while. He and his son talked about work, life plans, conversations I was only half listening to. My mind was elsewhere, my thoughts tangled in a web I couldn't untangle. "Do you remember when we used to go camping?" my husband said suddenly, turning to his son. He nodded, a nostalgic smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, I do. You always tried to teach me how to fish, but I was terrible at it." They laughed, and for a moment it felt almost normal. Almost. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, my husband stepped away to take a call. I was left alone with his son, the silence between us louder than any conversation. "You're quiet today," he said, breaking the stillness. "Just tired," I replied, not meeting his gaze. "You don't seem tired," he countered, his voice soft but insistent. I turned to him, finally meeting his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Doing what?" "This," I gestured vaguely, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Whatever this is." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Because I see something in you," he said finally. "Something that feels real. And I think you see it too." His words hit me like a blow, the truth of them cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. I stood abruptly, brushing off my skirt. "We should head back," I said, my voice tight. As we walked back to the car, the tension between us felt almost unbearable. My husband chatted happily, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt the weight of his words pressing down on me. Something that feels real. He was right, I couldn't deny it any longer. But the question lingered in my mind, heavy and unrelenting. What was I willing to risk for it? The following day I tried to immerse myself in routine. It was a quiet morning. My husband had left for work, and I convinced myself that I could reclaim some semblance of normalcy. The kiss, the words, the looks, all of it had to be put aside. I couldn't allow this to spiral any further. But as the hours ticked by, the stillness of the house started to feel oppressive. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made my heart jump. He entered the kitchen, his presence instantly filling the space. He was dressed casually, his hair slightly tousled as if he'd just woken up. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. I nodded, keeping my attention on the coffee maker. "Morning." He leaned against the counter, too close for comfort, watching me with that same unreadable expression that seemed to unnerve and intrigue me all at once. "You seem tense," he said, his tone conversational but pointed. "I'm fine," I replied, though my voice betrayed me. "Are you?" he pressed, his gaze unwavering. "Because it doesn't look like it." I turned to face him, meeting his eyes for what felt like the first time in days. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my frustration bubbling to the surface. His expression softened, but there was an edge of determination in his voice. "I just want to understand why you're fighting this so hard." "Because it's wrong," I shot back, my voice firmer now. "You're my husband's son. Do you have any idea what would happen if—" He cut me off, his tone steady but intense. "If what?" "If we were honest about what's happening? You think I don't know the risks? You think I don't feel the same fear every time I look at you?" The air between us grew heavier, the silence stretching like a taut string. I took a step back, needing to create some distance, but his words lingered, pulling at the fragile threads of my resolve. That evening, my husband invited an old neighbor over for dinner. A warm, chatty woman who loved to share stories about her travels. It should have been a pleasant evening, an escape from the storm brewing within me. But as the hours passed, I found myself increasingly aware of his son's presence at the table. He was quieter than usual, his gaze meeting mine more often than it should have. Once, as I reached for the salt, our hands brushed and I pulled away too quickly, nearly knocking over my glass of wine. My husband and the neighbor laughed, assuming it was clumsiness, but I saw the flicker of a smile on his son's lips. "Are you all right?" my husband asked, his tone light but concerned. "Just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's been a long day." As the evening wore on, the neighbor began recounting stories from her recent trip. I nodded along, barely listening, my thoughts consumed by the man sitting across from me. At one point I caught him watching me, his expression unreadable. It sent a shiver down my spine. After dinner, I excused myself to the kitchen to start cleaning up. A few minutes later, he appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with that same casual confidence that unnerved me. "Need help?" he asked, his voice low. "No," I replied quickly, my back to him. "I've got it." But he didn't leave. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence looming behind me. "You can't keep avoiding me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I spun around, my heart pounding. "I'm not avoiding you," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. He took a step closer, closing the gap between us. "You are," he said, his tone soft but firm. "And it's only making this harder." I could feel the heat of him, the pull of his presence. My mind screamed at me to walk away, to put an end to this once and for all. But my body refused to move. Before I could say anything, the sound of footsteps in the hallway broke the moment. My husband's voice called out from the living room and we both froze. "I should go," he said, his voice quiet, almost regretful. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As he walked away, I leaned against the counter, my breath shaky. The tension was unbearable, the line between us thinner than ever. That night as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I told myself I needed to stop this, to rebuild the walls that had crumbled around me. But deep down I knew it was too late. The line had already been crossed and there was no turning back. The morning air felt heavy, as if the house itself was aware of the growing tension inside its walls. My husband had left early for a meeting, leaving me and his son alone once again. I tried to stay busy, folding laundry, dusting shelves, anything to distract myself. But every creak of the floorboards, every muffled sound from upstairs, reminded me that he was here. When I finally allowed myself a moment of rest, settling onto the couch with a book, I heard his footsteps descending the stairs. My heart sank and raced all at once. He walked into the living room, his casual stride betraying none of the weight I felt. He held a cup of coffee in one hand and leaned against the doorway watching me. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his tone light but pointed. "I've been busy," I replied without looking up from the book. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he crossed the room and sat down on the opposite end of the couch. The space between us felt charged, like the air before a storm. "You know," he began, his voice softer now, "this isn't easy for me either." I set the book down, finally meeting his gaze. "Then stop," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Stop making it harder." "I've tried," he admitted, his expression earnest. "But it's like every time I see you it gets worse. I can't stop thinking about you." His words hit me like a blow, stirring something I wasn't ready to confront. I looked away, my hands gripping the edge of the couch. "You don't understand what you're doing," I said, my voice trembling. "Don't I?" he asked, leaning closer. "You think I don't see it? The way you look at me when you think no one's watching? The way you react when I'm near you?" "Stop," I whispered, but my resolve was crumbling. "I can't," he said simply. "And I don't think you can either." Later that day, my husband called to say he'd be home late. It was a relief, but it also left me vulnerable. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the house in golden light, I tried to convince myself to leave, to go anywhere that would put distance between us. But my feet wouldn't move. Instead, I found myself in the kitchen preparing dinner. He appeared again, as if drawn to me by some invisible thread. He stood in the doorway, watching silently for a moment before stepping closer. "Need help?" he asked, echoing the night before. "I'm fine," I said quickly, keeping my focus on the cutting board. He didn't leave. Instead, he moved closer, his presence a magnet pulling at me. I could feel him just behind me, the warmth of his body, the quiet intensity of his gaze. When I turned to reach for something, our faces were suddenly inches apart. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because I can't help it," he replied, his voice low and steady. "And I don't think you can either." I should have pushed him away, should have told him to stop. But instead, I stood frozen as he closed the gap between us, his lips brushing mine. This kiss was different from the first. Deeper, more deliberate. It wasn't tentative or fleeting. It was the kind of kiss that made the rest of the world fall away. For a moment, I let myself get lost in it. The feel of his hands on my waist, the heat of his breath. It was intoxicating in a way I hadn't felt in years. But then reality came crashing back. I pulled away, stepping back as if burned. "This can't happen," I said, my voice shaky. "We have to stop." "I don't think you believe that," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. "You need to leave," I said finally. He hesitated, but eventually I heard his footsteps retreating. When I was alone again, I pressed my hands to my face, my heart pounding. What was I doing? How had it come to this? That night as I lay in bed, the guilt was suffocating. My husband returned home, tired and oblivious, kissing me lightly on the cheek before collapsing into bed. I stared at the ceiling, the memory of the kiss still burning on my lips. I knew I was on dangerous ground. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not even close. The following days were a blur of guilt and tension. I avoided him as much as I could, but it was impossible to escape entirely. The house felt smaller, every shared space charged with unspoken words and stolen glances. My husband, blissfully unaware, went about his days as if nothing had changed. I envied him for it. One evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, my husband came into the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, his expression unusually serious. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone laced with concern. "Is everything all right?" I forced a smile. "Of course. Just tired." He nodded, though his eyes lingered on me a moment longer. "If there's anything you need to talk about, you can, you know." "I know," I replied, my voice softer now. "Thank you." He kissed my forehead and left the room, leaving me alone with the weight of my thoughts. I wanted to tell him, to confess everything and free myself from the growing storm inside me. But the words wouldn't come. The risk was too great. The next day, as I sat in the living room flipping through a magazine, I heard footsteps approaching. I tensed instinctively, knowing it was him. He entered the room, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said simply. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied without looking up. "You know that's not true." His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening." I set the magazine down, meeting his gaze. "It has to stop," I said firmly. "Whatever this is, it has to end." "And you think saying that makes it go away?" He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "Do you really believe you can just ignore this?" "I have to," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I have no choice." He sat down across from me, his posture relaxed but his eyes intense. "You always have a choice," he said quietly. "You just don't want to admit what you really want." I stood abruptly, needing to put distance between us. "You don't understand what you're asking of me." "Don't I?" He rose too, his voice calm but insistent. "You think this is easy for me? Watching you, knowing how you feel, and not being able to do anything about it." "Stop," I said, my hands trembling. "Just stop." But he didn't stop. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tell me you don't feel it. Look me in the eye and tell me you don't want this as much as I do." I couldn't. The words caught in my throat, the truth too painful to deny. Instead, I turned away, tears stinging my eyes. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner, I felt his presence before I saw him. He stood in the doorway, watching me silently. "I'm leaving," he said finally. I froze, the knife in my hand hovering over the cutting board. "What?" "I think it's for the best," he continued. "I found a place. I'll move out tomorrow." My chest tightened, a mix of relief and something I couldn't name. "That's probably a good idea," I said, my voice barely audible. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I didn't want to leave without saying goodbye." "Thank you," I replied, my hands gripping the counter to steady myself. "For everything." He lingered for a moment longer, as if waiting for me to say something else. But I couldn't. Finally, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the ache in my chest. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt the emptiness of the house more acutely than ever. My husband slept soundly beside me, unaware of the turmoil raging inside me. I knew this was the right decision, that it was the only way to salvage what was left of my life. But as the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of me had already been lost. When morning came, I found myself standing by the window, watching as he loaded his things into his car. He glanced up once, his eyes meeting mine for the briefest of moments. Then he got into the car and drove away. The house felt quieter than ever. The morning felt heavier than usual, the kind of weight that settles not just in your chest but in the spaces around you. My husband had left early again, always busy, always somewhere else. The silence of the house pressed down on me, a constant reminder of everything that had transpired. I wasn't expecting him to come back inside, but there he was, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, holding a cookbook in one hand and wearing a faint, almost mischievous smile. "Can you help me with something?" he asked. I hesitated, my hands frozen mid-task. "With what?" "Dinner. Or well, dessert actually," he said, stepping further into the room. "I thought we could make a fruit salad. A sort of peace offering before I leave." I stared at him for a moment, the weight of his words settling over me. A peace offering. The simplicity of it stung, as if it could undo the chaos between us. "All right," I said finally, forcing a smile. He set the cookbook on the counter and began pulling out bowls and knives. I walked to the refrigerator, trying to push down the unease rising in my chest. My hands found 2 large watermelons, and as I turned back toward him, he glanced at me and burst into laughter. "Wow," he said, shaking his head with a grin. "I've always loved big fruits like that." The words were innocent enough, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a teasing edge that wasn't lost on me. I let out a laugh, shaking my head as I set the watermelons on the counter. "You're impossible," I muttered, but there was a warmth in my voice I couldn't hide. We began slicing and dicing, the air between us lighter than it had been in days. It felt strange, almost surreal, to share this moment of normalcy after everything that had happened. Then it happened, a sudden loud whirring noise that made me jump. The food processor had turned on by itself. I gasped, nearly dropping one of the watermelons. "What?" He looked just as startled at first, but then a sheepish smile spread across his face. "I think I hit the button when I turned for the knife," he admitted, reaching over to turn the machine off. I exhaled a laugh, pressing a hand to my chest. "You scared me half to death." "Sorry," he said, his grin widening. "Didn't mean to make you lose your grip on the melons." The double meaning wasn't lost on either of us, and for a moment the tension broke. We laughed genuinely, the sound filling the kitchen and spilling over into the quiet corners of the house. When the salad was finally finished, we stood side by side, tasting our work. The sweetness of the fruit was almost overwhelming, but it couldn't mask the bittersweetness of the moment. "This is really good," he said, his tone softer now. "It is," I agreed, setting my fork down. "You've always been good at making things complicated." He looked at me then, his smile fading. "I don't regret it," he said quietly. "Any of it." I met his gaze, my chest tightening. "You should." "Do you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I turned away, busying myself with cleaning up the mess on the counter. Later that evening, he left. I watched from the window as he loaded his bags into the car, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look back as he drove away, and I didn't allow myself to hope that he would. My husband came home an hour later, his usual smile in place as he kissed me on the cheek and asked about my day. I gave him the same answer I always did: it was fine, and pretended not to notice the way my voice trembled. That night as I lay in bed, the house felt impossibly quiet. My husband's breathing beside me was steady and familiar, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside me. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the moments of the day in my mind. The laughter, the fleeting touches, the unspoken words that hung between us like unfinished sentences. I knew the silence wouldn't last. The memory of him, of us, would linger, a constant reminder of the line I had crossed. But for now, I clung to the fragile hope that I could rebuild the walls around my heart and keep the truth buried where it belonged. Because some secrets were too dangerous to tell.